Dr. Edward Carmichael thought he was the undisputed king of the surgical ward, and he had just publicly humiliated and fired the quiet new nurse for daring to question him. He expected her to walk away in tears. He never expected a four-star general to march through the hospital doors. St. Jude's Medical Center in Boston was a hospital that catered to the elite, the wealthy, and the powerful. And on the fourth floor, the cardiothoracic ICU, everyone bowed to one man, Dr. Edward Carmichael. Carmichael was brilliant, and he knew it. He had the kind of resume that brought millions of dollars in grants to the hospital, which meant the administration looked the other way when his God complex flared up. He wore custom-tailored scrubs, drove a silver Porsche 911, and had a reputation for destroying the careers of anyone who bruised his fragile, towering ego. To Carmichael, nurses were not colleagues. They were simply background noise, the hired help, whose sole purpose was to hand him charts and fetch his coffee exactly how he liked it. Enter Evelyn Hayes. Evelyn was 32 years old and the newest addition to the ICU nursing staff. She didn't look particularly remarkable at first glance. She kept her dark hair pulled back into a severe practical bun, wore standard-issue nursing shoes, and spoke with a quiet, unshakable calmness. If anyone had bothered to read her personnel file closely, they would have noticed large, vague gaps, classified only as government contract work overseas. But at St. Jude's, all they saw was a new transfer, who needed to learn the brutal hierarchy of Ward 4. Her first run-in with Carmichael happened on her third day. It was during morning rounds. Carmichael was leading a pack of terrified medical students and residents rattling off orders for a 60-year-old bypass patient. He barely glanced at the chart before snapping his fingers. Start him on a heparin drip immediately. Let's get his blood thinned out before we look at discharging him to step down. Carmichael ordered, his voice echoing loudly down the corridor. The residents furiously scribbled on their clipboards, but Evelyn, standing quietly at the foot of the bed, looked down at the patient's updated labs that had come in just 10 minutes prior. She stepped forward, her voice low and even. Dr. Carmichael, the patient's platelet count dropped significantly overnight. A heparin drip right now presents a high risk for spontaneous internal bleeding. Should we hold off and run another CBC? The entire hallway went dead silent. The residents stared at Evelyn as if she had just slapped the Pope. Carmichael slowly turned around, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. He looked Evelyn up and down, taking in her standard scrubs and lack of a fancy title. "And you are?" he asked, his tone dripping with venom. "Evelyn Hayes, doctor. I'm the new ICU nurse." "Well, Nurse Hayes," Carmichael sneered, stepping aggressively into her personal space. "When I want a glorified bedpan changer to give me medical advice, I'll ask for it. Until then, you will shut your mouth, follow my orders, and let the actual physicians do the thinking. Do you understand me?" Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply held his gaze with a cold, terrifyingly blank stare that, had Carmichael been a more observant man, would have warned him to back down. "Understood, doctor," Evelyn said softly. Later that afternoon, head nurse Brenda Walsh pulled Evelyn into the supply closet. Brenda had been at St. Jude's for 20 years and survived by knowing exactly whose egos to stroke. "Evelyn, you need to be careful," Brenda warned, her voice hushed. "Carmichael is not a man you cross. He got a senior anesthesiologist transferred to a clinic in the suburbs just last year because the man disagreed with him about an intubation protocol. He has the ear of the board. Keep your head down, do exactly what he says, and do not correct him in front of his residents again." He was about to make a mistake that could have killed the patient, Brenda. Evelyn replied, her voice devoid of emotion, as she restocked a box of syringes. "It doesn't matter. Brenda sighed. In this hospital, Carmichael's pride is worth more than a patient's life. Don't make an enemy out of him. You won't win. But Evelyn Hayes was not the kind of woman who knew how to back down from a threat. She had seen real monsters in her life, men who wielded weapons and terrorized nations. A surgeon with a superiority complex was nothing more than an undisciplined civilian throwing a tantrum. Over the next 2 weeks, Carmichael made it his personal mission to make Evelyn's life a living hell. He assigned her the most difficult patients demanded she work double shifts and took every opportunity to belittle her in front of the staff. He criticized her, mocked her stoic demeanor, and constantly threatened to have her written up for insubordination. Through it all, Evelyn remained a machine. She never complained, never cried in the break room like the other nurses, and never gave him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Her resilience only infuriated Carmichael more. He needed to prove he was the absolute authority. He needed to break her. He was just waiting for the perfect excuse to fire her. The opportunity Carmichael had been waiting for arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the form of a VIP patient named Robert Kensington. Kensington was a billionaire real estate developer and one of the hospital's largest donors. He had just undergone a grueling 8-hour cardiac tissue repair, performed, of course, by Dr. Carmichael. The surgery had been highly publicized, and Carmichael was already planning his interviews with medical journals to discuss his groundbreaking technique. Kensington was wheeled into the ICU, heavily sedated, and hooked up to a terrifying array of monitors. Evelyn was assigned as his primary nurse, a calculated move by Carmichael to ensure that if anything went wrong, he had a convenient scapegoat. For the first few hours, Kensington's vitals were stable. But as the afternoon wore on, Evelyn noticed a subtle shift. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a slight decrease in oxygen saturation, a barely perceptible change in the rhythm of the ventilator. She checked his chest tube and noticed the output had drastically slowed. She immediately paged Carmichael. 10 minutes later, the surgeon strolled into the ICU, a cup of artisan coffee in his hand, looking profoundly annoyed. "What is it now, Hayes?" He sighed, not even bothering to look at the patient. "Did a monitor beep and scare you?" "Mr. Kensington's oxygen saturation is dropping." Dr. Evelyn reported, her eyes glued to the screen. "His blood pressure is sliding, and his trachea appears slightly deviated to the right. I believe he's developing a tension pneumothorax." A tension pneumothorax was a life-threatening condition where air becomes trapped in the chest cavity, crushing the heart and lungs. It required immediate aggressive intervention. Carmichael rolled his eyes, finally stepping up to the bed. He pressed his stethoscope to Kensington's chest for all of 3 seconds. "You're overreacting as usual," Carmichael scoffed. "He's just fighting the ventilator. Push 50 milligrams of propofol and up his oxygen. He's fine. Doctor, if we sedate him further without relieving the pressure in his chest, his heart will stop." Evelyn warned, her voice rising just a fraction. "Listen to his left lung. There are no breath sounds." Carmichael slammed his hand down on the metal bed rail. "I am the chief of surgery. You do not diagnose my patients, and you do not question my orders. Push the propofol now." Reluctantly, under the direct order of the attending physician, the secondary nurse in the room administered the sedative. Less than 30 seconds later, the monitors exploded into a cacophony of alarms. Kensington's blood pressure tanked. 60/40, 50/30. His heart rate skyrocketed, erratic and desperate. The oxygen saturation numbers plummeted into the dangerously low 70s. "Code blue." The secondary nurse screamed, slamming the emergency button on the wall. Suddenly the ICU was flooded with medical personnel. Residents, respiratory therapists, and a crash cart came crashing through the doors. Carmichael, for the first time in his career, froze. He stared at the plummeting numbers, his textbook knowledge failing him in the face of sudden catastrophic chaos. He had ignored the warning signs, and now the hospital's biggest donor was dying right in front of him. "Push a milligram of epinephrine," Carmichael stammered, his usual confidence vanishing. "Start chest compressions." "Compressions won't work if his heart is being crushed by trapped air," Evelyn shouted over the alarms. "He needs a needle decompression." "Now." Carmichael stood paralyzed, his hands shaking. The residents looked at him, waiting for an order, but he was completely out of his depth. The billionaire's face was turning a horrifying shade of blue. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for permission. In a split second, the quiet, unassuming nurse vanished, replaced by a woman moving with lethal, terrifying precision. She shoved past a stunned resident and ripped open a sterile drawer, pulling out a massive 14-gauge angiocatheter needle. "Hayes, what are you doing?" Carmichael screamed, his panic turning to rage. "Step away from the patient. That is a surgical procedure." Evelyn ignored him entirely. She quickly swabbed the second intercostal space on Kensington's left chest. With a forceful, confident thrust, she drove the thick needle directly into the billionaire's chest cavity. There was a loud, distinct hiss as trapped air violently escaped from the chest. Instantly, the blaring alarms began to quiet down. Kensington's blood pressure rapidly climbed back to a survivable level. The oxygen numbers on the monitor ticked up 80, 90, 95. The color slowly returned to his face. Evelyn stepped back, her breathing, even having just flawlessly executed a battlefield trauma technique that saved the man's life. The room was dead silent, save for the rhythmic, steady beeping of the stabilized heart monitor. The residents stared at Evelyn in awe. But Carmichael was not relieved. He was humiliated. A nurse had just completely undermined his authority, taken control of his room, and saved a patient he had nearly killed. The rage that boiled up inside him was nuclear. He grabbed Evelyn by the upper arm and physically shoved her toward the glass doors of the ICU room, pulling her out into the main hallway where dozens of staff members, patients, and visitors were watching. "How dare you!" Carmichael roared, his face purple with fury, his voice echoing off the linoleum floors. "How absolutely dare you perform an invasive medical procedure without my explicit authorization?" "You were frozen, Doctor," Evelyn said, calmly pulling her arm out of his grip. "The patient was seconds from cardiac arrest. I intervened to save his life." "You intervened to play hero," Carmichael screamed, spit flying from his lips. "You are a reckless, arrogant, insubordinate liability. You could have killed him. You think because you read a textbook. You know better than me. I am a god in this hospital." Head nurse Brenda Walsh rushed over, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Dr. Carmichael, please, let's take this to your office." "Shut up, Brenda," Carmichael snapped. He turned his furious gaze back to Evelyn, pointing a shaking finger an inch from her face. "You are done," he hissed loud enough for the entire floor to hear. "I am stripping your credentials. I am having you blacklisted from every medical facility in the state of Massachusetts. You are fired, Hayes, effective immediately. Pack your locker and get out of my hospital before I have security throw you out onto the street." The hallway was incredibly tense. Nurses looked down at their shoes. Doctors awkwardly pretended to check charts. No one dared speak up to defend her. They all knew Carmichael had the power to end careers with a single phone call. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, looking at the sweating, screaming surgeon. There were no tears in her eyes. There was no panic. Just that same terrifyingly blank stare. "I will collect my things, Doctor," Evelyn said, quietly. She turned on her heel and walked calmly toward the staff locker room. Carmichael watched her go, a smug, victorious sneer spreading across his face. He had won. He had re-established his dominance. The natural order of Ward 4 had been restored. He turned back to the terrified residents, smoothing out his tailored scrubs. "Let that be a lesson to all of you," he barked. "There is zero tolerance for rogue behavior in my department." Carmichael went back to his office, poured himself an expensive glass of scotch from his private stash, and smiled. The trash had been taken out. But what Dr. Edward Carmichael didn't know was that Evelyn Hayes wasn't just a nurse, and by firing her so publicly, he hadn't just made a mistake. He had just triggered an earthquake that was about to bring his entire world crashing down. The immediate aftermath of Evelyn's termination sent a quiet shockwave through Ward 4. Dr. Edward Carmichael swaggered through the corridors with the puffed-up chest of a tyrant who had just crushed a rebellion. He updated Robert Kensington's chart conveniently, omitting the tension, pneumothorax, and his own failure to diagnose it, instead framing the sudden deterioration as an unexpected post-operative complication that he had expertly managed. Down in the locker room, Evelyn Hayes was methodically clearing out her narrow metal locker. She didn't slam doors. She didn't throw her stethoscope into the cardboard box. She neatly folded her spare scrubs, placed her favorite coffee mug on top, and closed the locker with a soft click. Brenda Walsh hurried in her face, pale and her eyes wide with sympathetic panic. "Evelyn, I am so sorry," the head nurse whispered, wringing her hands. "I talked to the union rep. We might be able to fight this if we get statements from the residents about the monitors. Don't put your neck on the line for me, Brenda," Evelyn said, her voice remaining as placid as a calm lake. "Carmichael will ruin you too. It's not worth it." But he was wrong. He almost killed Robert Kensington. Brenda urged, tears springing to her eyes. "You saved that man's life. You did a needle thoracostomy flawlessly. Most attending physicians can't do that under pressure, let alone a floor nurse. Where did you even learn to do that?" Evelyn picked up her box. "I've had a lot of practice in less than ideal environments. Thank you for being kind to me, Brenda. Take care of yourself." As Evelyn walked toward the staff elevators, the atmosphere outside St. Jude's Medical Center was rapidly shifting. It started with the screech of heavy tires on the wet pavement. Security guards stationed at the main entrance stepped forward as a convoy of 4 matte black Chevrolet Suburbans, flanked by 2 military police Humvees, blew past the valet stand and parked aggressively in the emergency roundabout. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the grand glass facade of the hospital. Hospital security rushed out walkie-talkies, buzzing, fully prepared to yell at whoever was blocking the ambulance bay. But the guards froze in their tracks as the doors of the Suburbans flew open. A dozen men in sharp suits with earpieces, federal security details, stepped out, securing the perimeter in a matter of seconds. Then the rear door of the lead SUV opened, and out stepped a man who commanded the very air around him. It was General Harrison Reed. General Reed was a 4-star general in the United States Army, the current commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. He wore his Class A green service uniform, the chest of his jacket heavy with rows of ribbons, service crosses, and a Purple Heart. He was a man with a face carved from granite, cold grey eyes, and a posture so rigid it looked as though he had swallowed a steel rod. He didn't pause for the security guards. He didn't check in at the front desk. Flanked by 2 armed military aides and 3 federal agents, General Reed marched through the sliding glass doors of St. Jude's Medical Center like a conquering force. "I need the 4th floor," General Reed barked to his lead aide. "Cardiothoracic ICU." The hospital administrator on duty, a nervous man named David Arris, practically sprinted across the lobby, his tie flying over his shoulder. "Excuse me, Sir General. You can't just bring an armed detail into a private hospital. Who are you looking for?" General Reed didn't even break his stride. He stepped onto the main elevator, his detail turning to block the frantic administrator from entering. "I'm looking for the woman who owns this hospital," General Reed said coldly as the elevator doors slid shut. Up on Ward 4, Carmichael was in his element. He was standing at the nurses' station, holding court with 3 terrified medical students, recounting a highly exaggerated version of a bypass surgery he had performed 5 years ago. "The trick to the myocardium is respect," Carmichael boasted, leaning against the counter. "You have to command the tissue. You have to assert dominance over the ding." The heavy double doors of the ICU wing swung open with a violent crash. The chatter at the nurses' station instantly died. Carmichael turned around, an annoyed reprimand dying on his lips as the wall of federal agents and military personnel marched into his pristine ward. The sheer presence of the men seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Carmichael, ever the opportunist, quickly assessed the situation. A 4-star general in full dress uniform, armed guards. This had to be a VIP situation. Perhaps a high-ranking politician or military official had been admitted, and the general was here to consult with the chief of surgery. With him, Carmichael smoothed his scrubs, plastered on his most charming, arrogant smile, and stepped forward to intercept the general. "General, welcome to St. Jude's," Carmichael said, smoothly extending a hand. "I am Dr. Edward Carmichael, Chief of Surgery and head of this ICU. Whatever situation brings you here, I assure you my team and I are the best in the country. How can I assist you?" General Reed stopped. He looked at Carmichael's extended hand, as if it were a piece of garbage on the floor. He did not shake it. "Are you the man in charge of this floor?" General Reed asked, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "I am," Carmichael said, dropping his hand, slightly unnerved but maintaining his bravado. "I oversee all personnel and patient care here." "Then you can tell me," General Reed said, his eyes narrowing, "where I can find Evelyn Hayes." Carmichael blinked. The name didn't compute with the situation. Hayes, the nurse. "Yes, Dr. Carmichael. The nurse." Carmichael let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Well, General, I'm afraid you've wasted a trip. Evelyn Hayes is no longer an employee at this hospital. I just fired her about 20 minutes ago for gross insubordination and reckless endangerment of a patient." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The federal agents shifted their stances. The military aides stared daggers at the surgeon. General Reed took one slow step toward Carmichael, closing the distance between them until he was towering over the doctor. "You fired her," the general repeated the words, dripping with dangerous disbelief. "Yes, I did," Carmichael said, his voice rising defensively. "She performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on my VIP patient. She is a liability, a menace, and, quite frankly, General, she has no business practicing medicine anywhere near civilized society." Before Carmichael could utter another word, a quiet voice cut through the tension. "I'm right here, General." Everyone turned. Standing at the end of the hallway, holding a small cardboard box of her personal belongings, was Evelyn. She still wore her plain scrubs, her hair still pulled back in that severe bun. But the moment General Reed locked eyes with her, the dynamic of the entire hospital floor shifted. General Reed completely ignored the sputtering chief of surgery. He turned his back on Carmichael, marched straight down the center of the hallway, and stopped 3 paces in front of Evelyn. The entire ward watched in absolute, breathless silence. Doctors, nurses, residents, and patients peeked out of their rooms. General Harrison Reed, commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, straightened his posture, brought his right hand up in a crisp, knife-like motion, and rendered a flawless, rigid military salute. Behind him, His two military aides instantly snapped to attention and saluted as well. Evelyn shifted her cardboard box to her left hip, stood up perfectly straight, and crisply returned the salute. "Captain Hayes." General Reed said, his voice carrying the deep, resonant respect of a soldier addressing a superior force. "It's just Evelyn now, sir," she replied softly, dropping her hand. "I'm a civilian. You will never be just a civilian to me, Captain." Reed said, his strict military facade cracking just enough to show a deep, profound emotion. "Or to the 62 men of the 75th Ranger Regiment who are walking this earth today because of what you did in the Korengal Valley." Carmichael's jaw practically unhinged. The residents stared completely dumbfounded. Brenda Walsh covered her mouth with both hands. "General, I don't understand," Carmichael stammered, stepping forward, his arrogance desperately trying to claw its way back to the surface. "Captain, she's a floor nurse. She changes bandages." General Reed turned his head slowly, leveling a glare at Carmichael that had broken hardened terrorists in interrogation rooms. "Dr. Carmichael," the general said coldly, "the woman you just fired is Captain Evelyn Hayes, former lead trauma commander for the United States Air Force Para-Rescue Special Operations. She has done 3 tours in hostile territory. She has performed open-heart surgery in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter, taking active enemy fire. She holds the Silver Star and the Distinguished Service Cross. When my command unit was ambushed and I was bleeding out from a shrapnel wound to the chest, she didn't just change a bandage. She cracked my chest open in the dirt and kept my heart beating with her bare hands until evac arrived." Reed took a step toward the pale, sweating surgeon. "So when you tell me that she performed an unauthorized invasive procedure, I can only assume that she stepped in to save a life because you were too incompetent, too frozen, or too arrogant to do your damn job." Carmichael opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His world, his absolute authority, was shattering into a million pieces. "Now," General Reed continued, his voice echoing off the walls, "I came here today because the Department of Defense is opening a new classified trauma research facility in Virginia, and I need the best combat medic on the planet to run it. I was going to ask Captain Hayes to leave this hospital, but it seems you've saved me the trouble of negotiating her exit." Just then, the elevator doors pinged again. Out strode David Arris. The hospital administrator followed closely by a furious-looking woman in a designer suit. It was Eleanor Kensington, the wife of the billionaire patient Evelyn had just saved. "Dr. Carmichael," Eleanor Kensington shouted, marching down the hall. "I just spoke with the secondary nurse who was in the room. She told me everything. You froze, you misdiagnosed my husband, and you stood there while his heart was being crushed." Eleanor turned to David Arris. "My husband's lawyers are drafting the malpractice papers as we speak. We are pulling our $50 million endowment from St. Jude's immediately, unless this hack is stripped of his license and removed from this premises." Arris looked terrified. He looked at the furious billionaire's wife, the formidable 4-star general, and the arrogant surgeon who had finally pushed his luck too far. "Dr. Carmichael," Arris said, his voice trembling but firm, "I need your ID badge. You are suspended pending a full medical board review. Security will escort you off the property." Carmichael looked around frantically. His residents were looking away. Brenda Walsh was glaring at him. His empire had crumbled in less than 30 minutes. He slowly unclipped his badge and handed it over his hands, shaking his face, flushed with the ultimate humiliation, as 2 hospital security guards, the same ones who usually jumped at his command, took him by the arms. He was paraded past the nurse's station, a broken man. David Arris quickly turned to Evelyn, clasping his hands together in a begging motion. "Evelyn, Captain Hayes, Please. This is a massive misunderstanding. The hospital formally apologizes. We will double your salary. We will make you head of the ICU. Please stay. Evelyn adjusted her grip on her small cardboard box. She looked at the frantic administrator, then over at the empty space where Carmichael had stood. "No, thank you, Mr. Orris," Evelyn said calmly. "The management here is a bit too emotional for my taste." She turned to General Reed. "Virginia, you said, 'Wheels up in an hour, Captain.'" Reed smiled. Evelyn nodded, walking past the stunned hospital staff and out the double doors, leaving the politics and the arrogance behind her, ready for her next mission. Sometimes the quietest people in the room carry the loudest history, and true authority is earned on the battlefield, not demanded from a hospital hallway. Ego will always shatter when confronted with genuine heroism. What did you think of Captain Hayes putting the arrogant surgeon in his place? Drop a comment below, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe for more incredible real-life drama